Now, let's get to the main issue here. I want to talk about this clip, and then I'm going to talk about an article by Doug Wilson. Now, I need to say about Doug Wilson, I know there's some of you would probably love for me to weigh in on other things that Doug Wilson has said in the past, and that's not for this episode, and it's not that those things aren't important, but for this episode, I have a narrow focus. It's one thing that I want to talk to you about, okay? And I just saw this on my Facebook feed. A lot of people were talking about it. I don't know if anyone else's Facebook feeds are the same way, but I thought, this is a good opportunity to talk about this. So here, I first want to play for you a clip here. This is from, who is this from? This is on the Holy Post podcast with Phil Vischer, and it's Kaitlyn Schiess, I believe is the name. Kaitlyn Schiess. And here's what she has to say. Now, Kaitlyn Schiess has written for Sojourners online. That gives you an idea of kind of where she's at. Jim Wallace's organization. She's on the Holy Post podcast. So obviously on the left for an evangelical standard, certainly on the left. So here's her. And so she says this to say about affections, and really it's the responsibility that we have for our own children versus the responsibility we have for other people's children. Take a listen.
Another thing that struck me while I was reading this article was how often the author did a wonderful job of highlighting moments when she was talking to people who were a part of creating this policy, who had to step away from speaking to her because their child needed something. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason that it struck me especially is because I have found myself among many Christians, probably people ideologically similar to the people Sky was describing, who would do anything for their own children. And it's ironic. We've talked multiple times in the podcast about parents, fighting for their kids to not be exposed to CRT in the classroom, or evangelical Christians especially have this reputation of being pro-family, fighting for their kids, protecting their kids. And it is a deeply Christian idea to think that you have an obligation beyond your immediate family. And if we are not learning that in our churches, learning that for Christians, there's no such thing as other people's children, that you have an obligation to the hurting, vulnerable children proximate to you and those who your actions, whether very abstract to you or not, affect in another part of the world or another part of your country. If we're not cultivating that on a spiritual level, if we're not teaching about that, if we're not talking about the fact that we cannot primarily protect our own family, our own interests, our own way of life, but that we should be intimately, deeply concerned with protecting children who are not our biological children or our nuclear children. If that doesn't start in the church, it's no wonder that when it would really hurt you politically or hurt you materially to stand up for children who are being forcibly separated from their parents at the border, that you wouldn't have the resources to do it because you haven't been properly formed by the church into the kind of person who thinks of those children as your responsibility as well. And that's the kind of small thing that if you feel helpless about this thing that has already happened, that's something to look in your own community and think, are we being formed into the kind of people who see hurting, vulnerable people in our community and think there's no such thing as other people's children? Those are my responsibility too, to care for and protect.
Okay, that was Kaitlyn Schiess talking about the border situation and kind of just adopting the narrative of the left that the Trump administration just wanted to separate kids and parents. And we've talked about that before. I mean, there's a massive influx or a massive amount of people coming across the border. We can't always verify whether the kids are actually, that those are their parents, so that there has to be a separation sometimes to figure that out. There's not enough border agents. There's a lot of problems, and those problems stem back to years prior to the Trump administration. This stuff was happening during the Obama administration, and no, they're not in cages. They are in places where they're secure, but it's not like they're being fed, they're being clothed, all that, right? But Kaitlyn Schiess and the rest of them on the Holy Post kind of just buy this, the progressive narrative about this. And like ideologues and progressives, they do this flatlining thing with love, okay? This is how a progressive loves. It's kind of like what I was talking about earlier with diversity, or an ideologue loves. So I don't have to know anyone diverse, like from another background, and be friends with them to care about diversity, right? As long as I care about the concept of diversity, I'm good. And it's similar in this, where you can like love everyone equally across the whole world. Well, obviously you have limitations. You cannot do that. But in their conception, in their mind, yes, you can, because an all-powerful government can do it. And I guess they just get resources from magic trees or something. I don't know. But if the government can do that, like, the important thing is that you care about everyone else's children. And the distinction that's under attack here is the difference between your children and other people's children. Your people, other people's, their people. Your region, other people's regions. You know, whatever it is, you pick the things that you have in common with other people and that constitute a group or a nation or a family. Those things need to be eroded, those boundaries. That's what Marxists have been doing in various forms for a long time. And so her statement here, no such thing as other people's children. If you think about it, it's kind of dumb, okay? Because obviously there's such a thing as other people's children. God does not hold you as accountable for those children. Now, of course, if you're in the store and you're running around and you bump into another person's child and you hurt them and there's a responsibility there and you were negligent, okay, yes, you have a responsibility because you did something foolish. But in and of itself, apart from your actions in the common realm, you're not feeding, clothing. You're responsible for the kinds of things that you have responsibility towards your children for. That's why if you don't feed your children, if you don't protect your family, that kind of thing, if you fail to provide for your own family, you're worse than an unbeliever. That's why children even have responsibilities to their parents. It's a two-way street. Children, obey your parents, and the Lord for this is right, and you will live long on the earth. These are just biblical truths. And to make sense of those biblical truths, you need this distinction. There's your children, there's other people's children. And it's the ideologue who wants to wipe that away. No, you can just love everyone equally. So yeah, I love the world. I can't tell you any people I love in the world, but I love them all. And I love someone in Timbuktu the same as I would someone in my own house. Same kind of love. Really? Really? Well, then you must be an evil person, because you must not love them, because, or else, I mean, you got some priorities you got to figure out here, because why would you be, I mean, because there's so much more that just even comes with love. There's the responsibilities. There's obligations. And if you feel an obligation towards someone in Timbuktu who should have people around them that would be shouldering those kinds of obligations, and you don't have the same, or you have the same level, but it's for someone in your own household, but it's no more than, or no less than, it's exactly the same. When is your capacity, say, maximized? You know, we're full. I mean, how many people can you actually love in the same way? You can't. I mean, you can, one wife, you can have a certain amount of kids, but then there's a human scale problem that happens. You just you have limited time. So this is the kind of thing that can only be, it translates from a concrete reality into an abstraction, where it's the government that needs to love all these people, and as long as you assent to that idea and you're pushing for that, those programs that do that, and you're committed to the concept of equality, diversity, loving other people's children, then if you don't do those things, you must be horrible. You're a bigot. But it all plays into this totalitarianism we're seeing. So she attacks this. There's no such thing as other people's children, and we need to think of other people's children as our responsibility as well. We need to think of them as our responsibility as well. This is dangerous. This is dangerous. You have limitations. You weren't made for that. That would stress you out completely, by the way. They're your responsibility insofar as you interact with them and have dealings with them, but not in the same way that their parents would have a responsibility for them. Not in the same way that their local area and the people there would have a responsibility for them. So put it into this situation of the border. Whose responsibility is it when someone crosses the border illegally, whether it's their children or their smuggler using children as a front? Whose responsibility are those kids? Is it the responsibility of Americans now? How about the whole world? Is it the responsibility for Americans to feed and clothe and take care of and make sure that all the children of the entire world are cared for, or is it the responsibility of Americans to take care of their own children? See, these are questions that need to be asked, and you're going to come up with limitations if you try to. It's like the boat that's taking on too much water. If you try to expand the responsibility, the natural relationship that exists beyond to include all these other children that should have their parents. And sometimes we live in a sin-cursed world. Sometimes parents shirk their responsibilities. It's happening more in our country too. And so then where does the responsibility fall? Well, it's think of it as proximity. It's those outer levels, those outer circles. You have extended family, you have community, you have friends, you have it. Who is it then? Good Samaritan is a good example of this. I mean, it's not, you come across someone hurting on the road and that person's not related to you. That person's different than you. But the proximity is, I came across them on the road. So I have a responsibility to at least provide some temporary care for that person, but it's a proximity thing even there. So I think there's a recognition here that even with the Trump administration and before them, the Obama administration, I think there's a recognition that, all right, these children, it's not their decision generally to come across and do something illegal. And so, yeah, we're going to try to get to the bottom of this. We're going to separate them. We're going to try to verify if that's actually their parents. We're going to feed them. We're going to clothe them. There's responsibility being taken in that. But somehow it's not enough. And it never is, by the way, for progressives. It never is. It's you have to love them more. And the real angle, the real attack here is get rid of that distinction between your children. You love your children so much. I mean, you who crafted policies that separate kids, you love your children so much. Why can't you love those children in the same way? Well, because they're not in the same situation, and they're not my kids. My responsibility is to protect my kids. My responsibility is to fight for my country. My responsibility is to help my local community. It's good to help other people, it's fine, but that's not your primary obligation. This is a principle that has been understood, I think, the basics of it at least. Not that there's not warped versions of it around, but these basic distinctions have been understood pretty much forever until recently. As far as I understand, I mean, you read any of the church fathers, you read your reformers, you read not even just in church history, in pagan history. You go back to the Greco-Roman, like this was just understood. The house, the oikos, the family, that was a unit to be held in sacred reverence, to be cherished, and to be loved above other families. So you do it on Father's Day, world's best dad. Really? Is that really the world's best dad? Did you run the study? No, it's my dad. That's what I'm talking about. Should you just that's wrong. We should, there's no such thing as other people's dads. Would anyone say that? They're just, everyone's just dads. And you take the category of dad and it's just an abstraction. It's meaningless at that point. It only has real meaning. And of course, there is a category for dad. I'm not saying there's not, but the unique thing or the important thing for you as an individual is your dad, the relationship you have. That is a meaning that is different than the relationship you have with your friend's dad. So I'm beating the dead horse, but that's a problem, and that's how the left thinks. Now,